Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I still think about that night every time I take the switchback down the ridge. The one where the guardrails bent and the trees drop off into nothing but dark. Back then, I'd only been driving for the app a few months, trying to make extra cash after my day job at the hardware store in a little Appalachian town tucked between the coal ghosts and the tourist cabins. Nights were easy money out here, or so I told myself. Fewer cars, fewer cops, and most folks just wanted a quiet ride between the bars down in the valley and the trailers up in the hills. That night started like any other. A thermos of gas station coffee, a country station buzzing low through fuzzy speakers, the smell of old vinyl and pine air freshener in my beat-up 2007 Toyota that shook whenever it slipped into third on those steep climbs. The app pinged a little after 1. 30 inches the morning, somewhere past the last open bar. A pickup request at Mountain Market, one of those tiny gas stations clinging to the side of the highway like it's afraid of falling off the mountain. Normally, I don't question rides. You accept, you drive, you don't think too hard. But as soon as the request came through, something in my chest tightened like a fist. No reason, no warning, just that quiet little alarm your body rings before your brain catches up. I almost ignored it. Almost. The money looked good. Surge pricing, lighting up the screen in red, and out here you don't turn down extra cash unless you really have to. So I told myself I was being dramatic, tapped accept, and started down the hollow. The higher I drove, the emptier the world felt. The houses thinned out, turning into dark shapes behind sagging porches. Christmas lights still clung to a few roof lines, even though the holiday had passed. The fog had rolled in low and thick, hugging the road in patches so that my headlights carved tunnels through the whiteness. I remember thinking it was the kind of night where anything could happen and no one would be around to see it. When Mountain Market finally came into view around a bend, my stomach sank. The place was completely dark. No buzzing fluorescent sign, no hum from the coolers, no clerk smoking out front like usual. The gravel lot lay empty except for a single overflowing dumpster and a rusted ice chest with half the letters worn off. For a second, I thought the app had glitched, sent me to the wrong spot. But then my high beam swept across the front doors and caught movement. A figure, pacing tight, jerky circles in front of the store, head down, shoulders hunched inside a dark jacket. I slowed way more than I needed to, letting the car crawl across the gravel. I wanted time to look at him, and if I'm being honest, I wanted time to decide if I was about to hit the lock button and drive away. The guy looked early 30s, maybe younger if life hadn't done such a number on him. His hoodie was so worn it clung to him like wet paper, sleeves frayed, one elbow ripped open with strings hanging loose. I noticed his jeans next, dark patches around the knees and thighs that at first I took for mud. Except mud doesn't dry almost black. He kept flicking his head to the side, scanning the tree line like something might step out at any second, then glancing back at the road as though expecting a whole line of cars behind me instead of one lonely sedan. His hands were what really got me. They didn't hang loose the way relaxed hands do. They curled, tense, fingers twitching. Even from the car, I could see something smeared beneath his fingernails, maybe grease, maybe dirt, and for one wild moment, my brain whispered that same word again. Blood. I almost hit cancel. My thumb hovered over the screen, and in that second I thought of my rent, my overdue truck payment, my mom's medical bills back in town. I told myself he was just drunk or high or both, that people look worse under parking lot lights, that if I treated him like everyone else, he'd behave like everyone else. I unlocked the doors. He yanked open the back passenger door and slid in, bringing with him a wave of sour sweat, old smoke, and something sharp underneath it, like metal that's been heated too long. He didn't greet me, didn't confirm his name, just sank low in the seat, one knee bouncing fast enough to shake the car. Regret hit me before I even shifted into drive. Out here, the mountains amplify silence. Usually I like that. It's peaceful, just me and the hum of the tires. Not that night. From the moment we pulled out onto the highway, I felt his eyes on me through the rearview mirror. Most passengers pretend the mirror is just a mirror. He looked straight into it. Straight into me, like he was trying to read whatever thought I was trying to bury. I tried to angle the mirror so I wouldn't keep catching his gaze, but it didn't matter. Every time I glanced up to check the road behind us, his stare was waiting. There was a tightness around his mouth that didn't match the slouch of his body. His jaw worked like he was chewing something invisible. I tapped the radio on just to crack the tension. Some classic rock station coming in grainy through the hills, and before the first chorus had even hit, he snapped out a command for me to shut it off. No, please. No explanation. Just a low, rough voice that had too many cigarettes carved into it telling me to kill the noise. My hands jerked on the wheel at the sound, and I felt a hot flash of irritation cut through the fear. I turned the radio off anyway. You pick your battles carefully when you're alone on a mountain road with a stranger. We drove like that for a while. The only sound, the engine straining on the incline and the faint rattle from the loose change in the cup holder. The app's route took us onto a narrower road, the kind the county forgets to salt when it snows. The trees leaned in closer, branches clawing at the sky above us. And every now and then a reflective sign would flash by warning of falling rocks or deer crossings. I tried to focus on those, anything normal, instead of the breathing behind me. When he finally spoke, it almost made me jump. He asked if I'd ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. No small talk about the weather. No, where are you from? Just that one question dropped heavy in the dark. I laughed, because that's what you do when you don't know how to answer, and said something about hoping the app screened people better than that. He didn't laugh. I watched his reflection lean back in the seat, move his lips like he was talking to himself, eyes unfocused. He started rambling after that, words slurring at the edges, but clear enough that I could follow the main thread. He said he used to drive for a different company, one of the big ones, how some kids had stolen from him one night, how he'd stopped trusting the folks who got into his car. The way he told it, it should have sounded like an old grudge, the kind of story people tell to justify why they quit. Instead, he smiled. Not a normal smile either. His lips stretched tight, but his eyes didn't move. The more he talked about being used, about people taking what wasn't theirs, the wider that wrong smile got. As he talked, we passed an old telephone pole where folks nailed up flyers. My headlights caught the white paper flapping in the wind. On instinct, I glanced over. It was one of those missing person posters. The face of a young woman with tired eyes staring out from the center. The words "last seen at Mountain Market" printed bold underneath. I felt my throat close like I'd swallowed something sharp. I flicked my eyes to the mirror just in time to see him notice the poster, too. His smile twitched and dropped for half a second, like a mask slipping, then came back even tighter. When he said it was funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you, my hands went slick on the steering wheel. I realized then I wasn't just giving a ride to some random guy who'd had a bad night. I was trapped in a moving box with someone who enjoyed the idea that I couldn't do anything about him being there. My pulse beat so loud in my ears I almost missed the way his story shifted. The words lost their shape, became half-sentences, apologies spilled into the air that weren't meant for me. He said he didn't mean it, over and over, voice dropping low, almost choked. He mumbled about someone who wouldn't stop screaming, about how it should have been quick, about a door that wouldn't lock. Somewhere in that muddle, he said he was a bad person, like he was stating a fact, not asking for disagreement. I stared hard at the GPS, each curve in the digital road a lifeline I clung to. I thought about pulling over right then, telling him the app had glitched, that I couldn't go any further. But the idea of stopping, of being stationary on a shoulder where he could reach forward and do whatever it was he wanted to do, felt worse than continuing. So I kept driving, heart racing, even as the route grew more isolated. A few minutes before we were due to reach his drop-off, he snapped fully back to attention. He lunged forward just enough that I felt the seat jolt behind me and shouted that I'd missed his turn. My eyes flew to the GPS. I was following the route exactly. There was no turn, not yet. but his voice changed the air in the car. That thin thread of pretend normalcy snapped. I hit the brakes harder than I needed to, tires skidding slightly on loose gravel as we slid toward the shoulder. He told me to pull over, not asked. Told. My hands trembled so badly, I almost shifted into reverse instead of park. I eased us onto the side of the road, engine idling, the dark pressing close on both sides. For a heartbeat, everything was motionless. Then I saw headlights cresting the hill behind us, slow and deliberate, wash of white swallowing our little patch of night. It was a sheriff's cruiser. Out here, we only have a couple who work nights. You get to recognize the shape of their cars, the way their light bars catch on low-hanging branches. A wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy, swept up from my chest to my throat. The cruiser slowed as it approached, spotlight flicking on, beam sliding across the guardrail, the trees, then my car. As that hard white circle touched us, I felt the man behind me shrink away from it. I didn't have to look to know. I could hear the way his clothes whispered against the seat, the rustle of fabric as he slid down. I risked a glance. He had laid himself almost flat across the back seat, head turned toward the door, eyes squeezed shut like a kid pretending to be asleep. His stained hands were tucked tight against his chest, fingers flexing. I jerked my head forward again before he could catch me watching him. The spotlight paused on us longer than felt comfortable, then drifted on. The cruiser rolled past, taillights shrinking around the next curve, leaving us alone again with the road and the trees and that thin layer of fear coating everything. The guy stayed folded down like that for a long, breathless moment that felt like it might never end. I didn't know if I should say anything, if acknowledging anything would break whatever fragile spell was keeping him still. My legs shook uncontrollably, heel bouncing on the floor mat. When he finally sat up, it was slow, like the air had thickened. He told me he'd gotten lucky in a tone that could have meant anything. Lucky the sheriff hadn't stopped. Lucky we were both still in one piece. Lucky he'd chosen to be wherever he was instead of somewhere worse. Before I could process any of it, he popped the door handle, slipped out into the dark, and was gone. No slamming door, no goodbye, just the quiet click and his shape swallowed by the trees. The app chimed that the trip had ended. I sat there, car idling, hands locked so tight around the wheel that my knuckles ached. I ended my shift right there on the shoulder, drove straight home with the taste of metal in my mouth and that missing poster burned into my brain. I couldn't bring myself to take another ride that week. It wasn't until a few days later, when I was scrolling aimlessly through local news on my phone during a dead moment at the store, that everything tilted for good. A headline about a robbery popped up, mentioning the state police asking for information. I clicked without thinking. The article said a woman working alone at a small gas station off the Highway Mountain Market had been attacked around closing time the same night I'd gotten that ride. The clerk had survived, barely, but the suspect had gotten away before the deputies arrived. They had attached a still from the store's grainy camera. The image was blurry, the face shadowed by a hood, but you can't mistake the shape of a walk or the way a person carries their shoulders when you've watched it from your rearview mirror for 30 minutes straight. The man in the photo stood at the counter, one hand on the edge, the other reaching into his pocket. The caption mentioned that Head left behind smeared prints that might be his, but they weren't sure yet. I stared at that picture so long my phone screen dimmed. I thought about those dark patches on his jeans, the smell that clung to him, the way Head slid beneath my line of sight when the law rolled by, and I realized that I hadn't been giving a ride to some hypothetical what-if. Id had the real thing in my car, in arm's reach, breathing the same recycled air. I wish I could say I did the brave, obvious thing and drove straight to the sheriff's office with everything I knew. It's not that simple for me, growing up out here. There were always reasons to avoid law enforcement, things I'd seen, family history I'd rather not drag back into the light. Part of me convinced the rest that whatever I remembered wouldn't make a difference. The camera had his face, the clerk had his voice. What was my scared version of events worth against all that? So I didn't call. I just started locking my doors the second anyone approached my car. Started canceling rides that didn't sit right. Started listening to that little alarm in my gut instead of arguing with it. Some nights, When I'm parked at the top of the ridge waiting for the next ping, I catch myself scanning every convenience store lot, wondering if he's still out there pacing under some other dead sign, hands twitching, looking for another driver who needs gas money more than they need peace of mind. I don't know if keeping this to myself makes me a coward or just another person trying to survive out here in the cracks of the mountains. I just know that night carved something into me I can't sand down. If you've ever driven these roads late or picked up someone who made your skin crawl for reasons you couldn't explain, I honestly want to hear it. Drop your own story in the comments. Tell me I'm not the only one second-guessing every ping after midnight. Story 2. My name is Dana, and for most of my adult life I thought I was a city person. I liked the idea of noise back then, traffic, humming, people arguing on sidewalks, a TV going in the next apartment over. It felt like proof I was not alone. That changed after one specific night I still can't talk about in detail, except to say there was a lot of screaming, a lot of metal twisting, and a sound so violent it felt like it split my chest open from the inside. Afterward, my psychiatrist gave it a name, phonophobia, and tried to explain it like it was just another diagnosis on a chart. But the reality was simpler. Every sudden sound felt like a weapon. A slamming door, a dropped pan, a horn 2 blocks away. My whole body would light up with painful pins and needles, like my nerves were bracing for something terrible that never arrived. I stopped sleeping, stopped going out at night, and started flinching so much at work that people just quietly stopped inviting me to anything. Eventually I realized I was not scared of life. I was scared of the noise of it. That was what sent me looking for something quieter. And somehow that's how I ended up in the Appalachian Mountains, on a narrow ridge road in western North Carolina, staring at a listing for a small cabin I found online at 3 in the morning. The pictures looked almost too good to be real. Dense forest in every direction, a gravel driveway climbing up from a 1-lane road, no neighbors in sight, no highway within earshot. The description said spotty cell service, like it was a drawback, but to me it sounded like a blessing. There was a short note at the bottom about older structures on nearby land and no active utilities beyond the main cabin. But I skimmed right past it because the only word I could see at the time was quiet. When I got there the first time, the real thing matched the photos almost perfectly. The cabin was small but solid, old timber walls darkened from years of rain, a stone chimney that gave it a kind of storybook feeling, and a covered porch that looked out over the tops of trees folding down into a long valley. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold earth, with something faintly smoky underneath from someone's distant wood stove. Inside, the place was bare but cozy. Thick beams in the ceiling, a fireplace that had clearly been used for actual warmth and not just ambiance, and built-in shelves lined with abandoned paperbacks and old travel guides. It smelled like pine cleaner, dust, and the kind of dry wood smell you only get in houses that have seen a lot of winters. For the first time since everything went wrong in the city, I felt my shoulders unclench. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch with a blanket and listen to nothing but insects, a distant owl, and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. I worked remotely on my laptop during the day, my internet boosted by a shaky satellite connection, and I told myself I didn't need anything or anyone else. Of course, that was before I realized that being far from people does not necessarily mean you are alone. There was one neighbor, technically, though I did not meet her for the first few days. The listing had said the nearest house was about a 10-minute walk down the ridge along an overgrown trail. I could not see it through the trees, just the hint of a roofline if I leaned over the railing in exactly the right spot. And honestly, I liked thinking of it as empty. The mountains have a way of making you feel like the world has been paused for your benefit. I let myself believe that. I did notice one thing early on that I brushed off at the time. My second night in the cabin, I woke up just after midnight to a low, steady sound I couldn't place at first. It was not thunder, not wind, not an animal. It was the subtle, rhythmic rumble of an idling engine somewhere down below the house. There were no headlights cutting through my bedroom window, no sweep of light across the ceiling, just that muted, unmistakable vibration rising up through the trees. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, then cut off abruptly. In the morning, when I walked down to the road to take my trash to the can by the entrance, I saw fresh tire tracks in the damp dirt. leading up close to my driveway and then backing away again. No one had any reason to come up here except me. I told myself it was a lost driver pulling off to check their phone, nothing more. Living alone in the woods, you learn very quickly which thoughts are safe to entertain and which ones will eat you alive at night. About a week after I moved in, I heard the first knock. There was no doorbell, just 3 quick raps on the wood that sounded loud in the thick quiet of the afternoon. My heart jumped the way it always did with sudden noise. But the sun was still high and I could see the bright slice of day through the curtains. So I forced myself to breathe, walked to the door, and opened it. On the small stoop stood a woman who looked to be in her late 60s, her gray hair long and pulled back in a loose tie, her eyes startlingly sharp and pale against her weathered face. She held a woven basket like it was part of her body, full of jars that clinked softly when she shifted her weight. She introduced herself as Helen and told me she lived at the end of the ridge, about a 10-minute walk if I followed the trail past my woodpile. Her voice was calm but direct, the kind of voice that skipped small talk and went straight to business. She handed me the basket with an insistence that did not match her polite words, her fingers brushing mine, ice cold. Jars of preserves, she said, blackberry and apple butter she had canned herself. There was something about the way she looked at me that made me feel less like a neighbor and more like someone who had wandered into a space that used to belong to her. She gave me advice instead of a welcome, telling me to keep plenty of fuel for my lanterns, to make sure my windows actually latched and not just shut, and to pay attention to what I heard at night, because the hills carried sound in strange ways. It all came out of her mouth like it was rehearsed, like she had said the same thing to other people standing on the same stoop. I smiled and nodded, because what else do you do in that moment? And when I finally closed the door behind her, I realized she had not walked away immediately. I stood there, holding my breath, counting seconds in my head, and only after almost a full minute did I hear her footsteps crunch along the gravel and fade. I set the basket on a shelf and never opened the jars. Life settled into a pattern after that. The days were quiet and light, the nights darker than anything I'd experienced before. When storms rolled in, they did it with a certain drama. Clouds catching on the peaks, wind building slowly until it flowed around the cabin like moving water. One evening, a thunderstorm hit in that intense southern mountain way hard sheets of rain. Deep rolling thunder that sounded like it was coming from inside the ridge itself. Sudden flashes of lightning that turned the trees into black cutouts. The power flickered once, twice, then gave up completely, knocking out the soft hum of the fridge and plunging the cabin into the kind of silence that actually has weight. It turns out that natural noise did not trigger my fear the way city noise did. Listening to rain hammer on a metal roof and thunder roll across valleys was strangely soothing, like the world was loud on purpose and I did not have to interpret every sound as a threat. I lit a few candles, made myself tea on the gas stove, and curled up in the living room with one of the old paperbacks I'd found on the shelf. For a while, I forgot to be afraid. At some point during the storm, I went to the kitchen window to watch the lightning while my tea steeped. And that was when I noticed the second thing that did not fit. Right in the center of the glass, at about the height of my shoulders, was a smeared handprint. It was on the outside, the wetness making it stand out, each finger clearly defined, the heel of the palm dragged slightly downward like whoever made it had pressed hard and then slowly slid. I had cleaned the windows myself the day before, more out of boredom than necessity, and I knew there had been nothing on the glass then. The porch did not extend under that window, and there was no reason for anyone to be that close to the house on that side. The print was just there, facing in. I told myself Helen had stopped by earlier without me noticing, maybe to drop off more preserves or check on me, and brushed it off. But I could not quite ignore the way my chest tightened each time thunder shook the cabin afterward. A few hours later, when the worst of the storm had passed but the rain was still steady, there came a pounding on the front door, so sudden and hard it felt like someone had struck my sternum from the inside. It was not polite knocking this time. It was urgent, insistent, the kind of banging you use when you believe the person on the other side is in danger, or you are. My nerves lit up, but I forced myself to walk over, flashlight in hand, pausing just long enough to peer through the narrow window beside the door. It was Helen, soaked through, hair plastered to her cheeks, holding a small flashlight that cut odd, jerky shapes through the rain. Her eyes looked even wider in the reflected beam. When I opened the door, she spoke fast, her words tumbling out, telling me she had seen someone near my woodpile through a break in the trees. A darker movement where there should not have been any. She kept glancing past me into the cabin, like she was checking for something or someone. I stepped out onto the covered part of the porch, pointed my flashlight into the wet darkness, and saw nothing but the vague outline of logs and the glint of rain on bark. Asking her if she was sure did not calm either of us. She insisted, and then, with the same abruptness she had arrived, turned and walked back into the storm along the trail, her little beam bobbing and then disappearing among the trunks. Once the door was shut again, the quiet in the cabin felt crowded. The story she had just told me did not add up. From where she said she lived at the end of the ridge, there was no clean line of sight to my woodpile unless she had been on my land already, close enough to see details through the storm. I locked the door, then walked from room to room, checking every latch, every window, every point of entry, hands shaking even though I was trying to convince myself she was just being a concerned neighbor who maybe had a flair for drama. I went to bed eventually, but my sleep was shallow, my ears tuned to every creak of the old wood, every rush of wind. Sometime after midnight, I woke up with my heart already pounding. At first I thought it was another clap of thunder that had dragged me out of sleep. But the storm had moved on. The air was still, the rain gone. What I heard instead was a small, sharp sound just outside my bedroom window, like a dry branch snapping under weight. The curtains were thin, and I could see a faint wash of moonlight behind them, enough to suggest shapes if I dared look. I lay there frozen for a long minute, every nerve in my body straining. Eventually, curiosity or self-preservation won out, and I slid quietly out of bed, crossed the room, and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see. At first, there was nothing but pale light on the trees and the slope of the hill dropping away. Then, at the edge of where the moonlight reached, I saw a figure. A person stood at the tree line, turned slightly away from the cabin, just a dark outline against darker woods. Long hair moved faintly in the breeze, and there was something familiar about the slight tilt of the shoulders. I squinted, trying to bring the outline into focus. And just as I did, the figure started to turn. I dropped the curtain and crouched down before I could see the face, or be seen in return. I stayed there on the floor, knees pressed to my chest, counting my breaths, willing my heart to quiet down. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to look again. But when I peeked out, the space was empty. No figure, no movement. Just trees and the pale cut of the slope. In the morning, when I finally stepped outside, I found the third thing that did not fit. On the ground beneath my bedroom window, the damp earth was disturbed. Footprints overlapping in a cluttered pattern, as if someone had paced there for a long time. The prints were not boots, but shoes, wide and heavy. And there was a different kind of mark on the wall itself, small crescents and smears at about hip height, like someone had been pressing their fingers against the siding, leaving pale streaks of mud as they traced back and forth along the wall. That same afternoon, as if the day had not been unnerving enough, I stepped out onto the porch to bring in a box and almost screamed. Lying perfectly centered on the porch railing was a dead rabbit. It had been arranged with its paws folded under its chest, its eyes still open, staring at the front door. There was no blood on the wood below, no sign of a struggle, just that small, limp body placed intentionally where I would have to see it. The cut on its throat was thin and clean. I stood there for a long time, every instinct screaming at me to go back inside, pack my things, and leave. But I made myself find a trash bag, use gloves, and remove it. I told myself a fox or coyote might have dragged it there, even though I knew that was not how predators behave, and forced myself not to think about fingers instead of teeth. That night, just when I was starting to convince myself I was being paranoid, there was another knock on the door, softer than the one in the storm, but still enough to send a jolt through my chest. I did not plan to answer it at all, but my body moved on its own, pulling me toward the entryway. Through the narrow pane of glass, I could see a man this time, broad-shouldered and bald, a thick beard framing a face that was turned away just enough that I could not read his expression. He wore a dark jacket that looked soaked at the hem, even though the sky had cleared hours earlier. My whole body locked up. Every horror story I had ever heard about isolated cabins flashed through my head at once. Instead of opening the door, I stepped backward, then backward again, until I hit the hallway wall and turned toward the bathroom, the only room in the cabin with no windows. I locked myself in there with my phone, calling the police with shaking hands. The dispatcher's voice was calm, practiced, telling me help was on the way and not to hang up. As we spoke, the man outside shifted from knocking to slamming his weight against the door. Each impact made dust fall from the frame around the bathroom mirror. At one point, there was a crack of wood splitting, and I could picture the door jamb giving way. I held my breath, covering my mouth to keep any sound inside. After a while, the heavy impacts stopped, replaced by a different set of noises: glass breaking, wood splintering somewhere in the living area, something heavy being overturned. It sounded less like a search and more like a rage tantrum, like someone was punishing the room itself. The dispatcher kept talking in my ear, grounding me with neutral questions, but my thoughts were already a few steps ahead, cataloging every object in the small bathroom I could use as a weapon if the thin, hollow core door between us suddenly flew open. Eventually, the smashing stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I waited for footsteps in the hall, for the weight of a body against the bathroom door, but nothing came. By the time the distant wail of a siren finally threaded its way up the ridge, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. The deputies were kind enough in the way small-town law enforcement can be when they are not personally inconvenienced. They looked at the broken door frame, the shattered picture frame across the room, the lamp lying sideways on the rug, the glass from the living room window scattered across the floor like ice. They took notes, asked a few questions, then stepped outside to look around. They walked the perimeter with flashlights, shining beams into the trees, but when I asked if they would search the woods properly, they shrugged and said it was too dense and the guy was probably long gone. I practically begged them to at least come with me down the ridge to Helen's place. They agreed more to appease me than out of any sense of urgency. We walked the trail past my woodpile, the dirt still scarred with prints I could not quite bring myself to study, and reached a small clearing where an older cabin sat back off the path. My first thought was that we had gone to the wrong place. The cabin sagged under the weight of years, its porch railing half-rotted, windows caked with grime, roof patched badly in places and missing shingles in others. No light glowed from inside, no car sat out front, no recent tracks marked the path. One of the deputies shined his beam inside through a crack in the boards and announced that the place was empty, had been for a long time, and that no one had lived here in years, as far as their records showed. I kept insisting that a woman had been on my porch with fresh preserves and detailed advice less than 2 weeks ago, but they only traded a quick look between them and suggested, gently, that I had probably been mistaken, that maybe I had seen an old caretaker passing through, or even a hiker. When I asked them to at least check inside the abandoned cabin for squatters, they said there was no sign of forced entry and it would be trespassing without cause. One of them reminded me, not unkindly, that living out on a ridge like this meant accepting that response times would be slow and risks would be higher, and that if I valued my peace of mind, I might be better off renting somewhere closer to town. They left me with a case number and a promise to keep an eye on things, which I knew meant very little once they drove back down the mountain. I did not sleep at all that night, even though nothing else happened. I spent the next day cleaning up broken glass, screwing a temporary board over the damaged front door, and packing up my essentials. I stayed one last night because it was too late to leave safely after I finished, and because part of me refused to let the ridge have that final victory over me. The quiet, which had once felt like a blanket, now felt like a hand pressed over my mouth. The woods were the same, the birds the same, the wind in the trees the same, but I heard everything differently. Every small crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, every distant engine down in the valley sounded like someone making a decision about me. I moved out the next morning and have not been back since. Life has been better in measurable ways. I sleep more, I jump a little less at sudden noises, and I can almost walk past a construction site without my body shutting down, but my mind goes back there more often than I like to admit. Friends who lean toward the supernatural love to suggest that Helen was some kind of spirit, a warning presence tied to that abandoned house at the end of the ridge, that the rabbit and the handprints in the break-in were all pieces of the same dark puzzle. I do not believe in ghosts. I think it is much more likely that there were real, breathing people using that empty cabin as a hideout, that one of them took an interest in me, and that Helen, whoever she really was caught somewhere between protecting her own secret and protecting me. I just cannot figure out why she would bother to warn me about someone near my woodpile and then watch my bedroom window from the tree line, or why someone would arrange a dead animal on my porch like a gift. Those questions do not have answers that make me feel any better. If you have ever lived alone in the mountains or had a neighbor who made your skin prickle for reasons you could not quite explain, I honestly want to know. Leave your story in the comments so I can see I am not the only one still replaying the sounds of a quiet house and wondering what or who was really standing just outside the glass. Story 3. My name is Aaron, and until last winter I would have told you my favorite place on earth was a 2-lane mountain road at midnight with someone I loved in the passenger seat and a playlist worn thin from playing too many times. My girlfriend, Lily, and I met in our sophomore year at a small university in the Blue Ridge, tucked deep enough into the Appalachians that fog rolled across campus like low clouds and you could hear trains echo up the valley at night. We bonded over being from the same world in a way most of our classmates weren't. She grew up in eastern Kentucky. I was from a little town in southwest Virginia, and there was something comforting about the fact that we both understood the rhythm of coal trucks, church bells, and high school football games without having to explain it. When we started dating, we made a tradition without really meaning to. Every Christmas, we split the holiday between our families. My parents have a small place on the side of a ridge, the kind where the driveway is so steep you have to gun the engine just right to make it up if there's even a dusting of snow. And her family lives about 2 hours away on the other side of the state line. My family does most of their celebrating on Christmas Eve, a big, loud meal that leaves the house overheated and full of voices. And her family focuses on Christmas morning. It made sense for us to do the drive in between, in the quiet hours when the hills go dark and the world feels like it has gone to sleep. That late-night drive became its own kind of ceremony, a liminal space between one life and another. Last year, that drive changed how I feel about silence, about phones, about the simple act of being on a road with no one else around. We left my parents' place just after midnight, my mother waving from the porch bundled in old winter gear. My dad already half asleep in his recliner with some Christmas movie still playing too loud. The air was sharp and cold, our breath turning white in the glow from the porch light. I could hear the creak at the bottom of the hollow more clearly than usual because the wind had settled, just a steady rush in the dark. As I walked toward my truck, I felt a little jolt of confusion I almost dismissed. The driver's side door was not fully shut. It was latched, but not all the way. The dome light inside was faintly glowing, the way it does when the sensor isn't sure the door is closed. I knew I had locked it earlier. Locking it is a habit so ingrained I sometimes double-check it twice, but there it was, slightly ajar. For a second I thought my dad might have gone out to grab something, but he hates the cold and never goes out once the sun's down if he can help it. There were a couple of footprints in the thin crust of snow beside the truck, too many to be mine alone, the tread wider and deeper than my sneakers would have made. I remember standing there, keys in hand, feeling my scalp prickle as I tried to decide whether I was overreacting. Lily was already halfway down the steps with an armful of gifts, laughing about how her mom was going to scold her for being late, and I didn't want to dampen the mood by turning everything into a mystery. I told myself I must have shut the door sloppily, that the extra footprints were from earlier in the evening when my cousin borrowed the truck to grab ice. I clicked the remote, heard the locks thunk, and tried to swallow the unease as I climbed in. We had our usual playlist ready. Mostly old pop-punk and some newer stuff Wed started to claim as ours. And by the time we crept down the gravel driveway to the main road, it felt like any other Christmas drive. The mountains were in one of those moods where the sky was clear but the valleys were full of fog, white bands of it lying low like rivers of smoke. We wound our way past dark houses and empty church parking lots, through little clusters of trailers lit by single porch bulbs, and then out onto longer stretches where the only signs of life were the occasional yard light far up on a slope and the thin lines of barbed wire fences glinting at the edge of my headlights. I love those roads, even when they're a little treacherous, the way they twist and fold, the way you feel suspended between sky and drop-off on some of the curves, but that night they felt different, like the dark was paying attention. A few miles into the drive, on a straight stretch between two larger bends, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw another set of headlights far back behind us. That's not unusual. There are only so many routes through the mountains, and late-night traffic tends to bunch up around the same shortcuts. What made my fingers tighten on the wheel was the way the lights behaved. They would appear over a small rise, grow brighter as the car caught up, then dim to an eerie glow as if the driver had turned them down or shielded them somehow. At one point, they dropped out entirely for several seconds, like the vehicle had slipped behind an invisible curtain, only to flare back to life again much closer than seemed possible. I kept checking the mirror, waiting for the car to pass us on one of the rare straightaways, but it never did. It just hovered at that same unnatural distance, as if whoever was driving wanted to be close enough to keep track of us, but not close enough to be seen clearly. I told myself it was someone with old headlights or a lazy alternator. Lily dozed off and on beside me, the glow from the dashboard painting her face in soft blue as our playlist ran in the background. I had just started to relax enough to enjoy the quiet when my phone, plugged into the console and running the music, cut out mid-song and lit up with an incoming call. The sudden silence made my whole body jerk. It was late enough that any unexpected noise felt wrong, as if it had to mean something was out of place. I glanced down just long enough to see that it was an unknown number. No name, no location. I let it go. Spam calls don't care about holidays or time zones. The music resumed, and I forced a joke about how even robocallers didn't respect Christmas. Lily smiled sleepily and rolled her head back against the seat. Less than 2 minutes later, the song cut out again. Same number, same disruption. Like a needle scraping across a record, irritation started to mix with unease. A low, buzzing annoyance that someone was interrupting what was supposed to be our quiet space. I let it ring out again. When it stopped, I glanced in the mirror. The lights behind us were still there, still hanging at that same distance, never quite committing to catching up or dropping back. The third time the phone rang, there was no build-up. It just cut straight through the middle of a chorus, plunging the truck into that strange, intimate silence you only get inside a moving vehicle when the engine sound is drowned out by your own heartbeat. I snatched the phone off the console more aggressively than I meant to, adrenaline overriding my better judgment. I was ready to tell someone off, to unload all the pent-up anxiety of the day onto whatever call center employee or glitchy system had decided we were a good target at 12:40 a.m. on a mountain road. When I answered, the first thing I heard was static, a low, crackling hiss that rose and fell in waves, like listening to an old radio that can't quite lock onto a station. I turned the volume all the way up, more to prove I was not afraid than because I needed to. For a few seconds, that was all there was. Then, very calmly, someone said my name. Not my nickname, not the version my friends use, but my full name, the one only family and official documents really touch. Hearing it in the dark from an unfamiliar voice did something to my nervous system I still can't entirely describe. It felt like someone had poured ice water down my spine, slow and deliberate. The voice was male, mid-range, with no obvious accent I could latch onto, and there was a strange neutrality to it, like he was reciting lines instead of speaking from anything as messy as emotion. I did not say anything at first, partly because I did not trust my voice to sound like mine, and partly because some irrational part of me believed that if I didn't answer, I could undo the fact that I had picked up. The man on the line did not seem to care whether I responded. He began reciting details about my life like he was reading from a file. My full name, my date of birth, the town where I grew up, the name of the gas station where Id worked summers in high school, my university, the fact that I was on winter break and due back in 2 weeks. With each new piece of information, My mind scrambled for an explanation, data breach, hacked account, some elaborate scam, but the way he delivered the facts felt too specific, too curated. At one point he mentioned the exact road we were on, the route number, and then casually noted that we had just passed a particular landmark. A small roadside memorial cross with faded plastic flowers and a laminated picture screwed into it, one I had noticed only in passing a few minutes earlier. That was the first moment I understood he wasn't just pulling data off the internet. He was seeing us, maybe from the car behind us, maybe from somewhere else along the road. I glanced at Lily, who was awake now, eyes wide, one hand gripping the door handle as if she might bail out at full speed. I wanted to pull over, but that seemed worse. The idea of being a stationary target on the side of a deserted road while someone who knew that much about me was watching felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My voice, when it finally emerged, sounded thin and far away in my own ears as I asked him what he wanted. There was a pause on the line, a small flicker in the static, and then he said that he wasn't interested in me. He was calling about Lily. Hearing her name from his mouth was like a punch. It took something abstract and made it personal in one breath. Lily's whole body went rigid beside me, and I could feel the air change around us, as if the truck had suddenly shrunk. I told him he had the wrong number, or the wrong person, that there was no one by that name with me. It was a flimsy lie, and we both knew it. But I wanted to put any barrier I could between this stranger and the person sitting next to me. He ignored the denial completely. He described her instead. He listed the town where she grew up, the name of her younger brother, the church her parents attended. He mentioned the brand of perfume she had worn the night we met, something I hadn't even known the name of until she laughed and told me later. Then he said, almost casually, that the green scarf she was wearing right now didn't match her coat, but that he liked it anyway. He could not have known that unless he was seeing us. As he spoke, the lights in the rearview mirror shifted suddenly, swinging out wide as if the car behind us had pulled into the oncoming lane to pass. But when I flicked my eyes up, there was nothing there at all. No headlights, no taillights, just the long, empty curve of road and the faint gleam of reflective paint on the guardrail. It was as if the vehicle had never existed or had turned off onto a side road I hadn't noticed. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to fight to keep the steering wheel steady. Lily reached over and grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold and hard as if shed turned to stone. In one quick motion, without asking, she stabbed at the screen and ended the call. The sudden dead silence in the truck felt like someone had sucked all the air out. I snapped at her, louder than I meant to, demanding to know why she had hung up when the only person who might explain what was happening was finally on the line. She just stared at me with this mix of fear and something I could not quite read, like guilt and anger and shock all braided together. She said she was scared, that she panicked, and that she didn't owe that voice another second of her time. I tried to call the number back. The screen showed call failed 3 times in a row. Not even a ring, just an instant error. I toggled between wanting to turn around and go back to my parents' house, wanting to drive straight to a police station, and wanting to get Lily to her family as fast as possible and pretend we could leave whatever this was behind us. In the end, I just drove, slower than before, but still too fast for the curves, eyes flicking from the road to the rearview mirror, half expecting another car to materialize out of the dark. The rest of the drive was quiet, the kind of quiet that's full of unsaid things. I didn't put the music back on. I couldn't stand the idea of another song cutting out. At one point, we passed under an overpass where the interstate crossed above us, and for a few seconds the sound of trucks overhead boomed down in a way that made my chest ache. It struck me how alone we were, how small, how easy it would be for someone to follow us on any of the dozens of side roads that branch off into emptier hollows where no one hears anything at night. When we finally pulled into her parents' driveway, a long gravel stretch lined with bare trees and a couple of rusting farm trucks, I half expected to see someone else waiting there. Some unfamiliar car or shadow. There was nothing. The house was lit from within, warm and ordinary. Her mother's seasonal wreath crooked on the front door. A plastic snowman listing to the side near the steps. Her little brother's bicycle lay where Head dropped it earlier. Everything looked so normal that I almost convinced myself the drive had been a strange anxiety episode, Wedge shared instead of something real. Over the next few days, we did all the things you're supposed to do during the holidays. We opened presents, we ate too much, we watched old movies with our families, we pretended we were fine. Her parents asked about the drive and we both said it was uneventful. It wasn't until about a week later, back at my own apartment near campus, that the third and final detail clicked into place and took the last bit of comfort I had left. I was cleaning out my voicemail inbox, deleting the usual backlog of automated messages and reminders, when I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. There was a voicemail with no caller ID, just a blank space where the number should be. It had been recorded at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, more than an hour before we left my parents' house, at a time I remembered clearly because we were all still sitting around the living room playing a board game, the TV muted in the background. When I pressed play, expecting static or silence, what I heard instead made my scalp crawl. It was my voice and Lily's, talking and laughing in my parents' driveway as we loaded the truck. I could hear the exact way the gravel crunched under our boots, the little comments we made about the cold, the sound of my mother's voice floating from the porch as she reminded us not to speed on the mountain roads. At one point, there was even the distinct beep of my truck unlocking, the small click of the driver's side door opening, and the shuffle of someone climbing in, except that on the recording there was an extra sound layered underneath a slow, deliberate breathing that didn't belong to either of us. It wasn't a butt dial. The angle of the sound was wrong, too distant from our phones. It was as if someone had been standing a little way off in the dark with a microphone aimed at us, recording our goodbye, then used that recording to time the later call or to study the way we sounded when we thought we were alone. I listened to it twice, then a third time, and each repetition made my own voice feel more alien. I didn't show it to my parents. I didn't send it to Lily. I told myself I would take it to the police. But I kept imagining the look on their faces when I explained, the way they'd nod sympathetically and tell me there wasn't much they could do with a voicemail that might just be a glitch or a prank. In the end, I saved the recording to a secure folder and changed every password I had, even though I knew that what scared me most wasn't a data leak. It was the knowledge that someone had been physically close to us, close enough to touch the truck, close enough to watch us without being seen, and that they had chosen to reveal themselves not with a confrontation but with a voice in my ear on a mountain road. Since then, I tense up every time my phone rings from an unknown number. I find myself scanning the shoulders of roads at night for parked cars with someone sitting just a little too still inside. When people joke about how our phones are always listening, I smile and nod, but what really keeps me up is the idea that sometimes it isn't the phone listening at all. If you've ever had a call that felt wrong in a way you still can't explain, or noticed a car behind you that seemed to be matching your route a little too perfectly, I'd honestly like to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments, because part of me needs to know, I'm not the only one who learned the hard way, that the scariest things don't need any ghosts at all. Just a dark road, a stranger's voice, and the fact that they know exactly where you are.